December 14, 2025. Belgorod region, roughly 50 kilometers from the Ukrainian border. A Russian S-400 unit from the 568th Anti-Aircraft Missile Regiment is doing what an air defense battery is built to do constantly: moving. Footage published afterward by Ukraine's 15th Separate Artillery Reconnaissance Brigade, call sign Chorny Lis, Black Forest, shows the unit's vehicles crawling down a field road mid-relocation, changing position the way doctrine demands. Briefly, and on no schedule an enemy is supposed to be able to predict. It did not save them. Within minutes, 2 launchers are wrecked. 4 long-range interceptor missiles are gone with them, still sealed in their canisters. Nobody was killed. What matters more than the strike is the question of how the battery was found in the first place, because a unit built specifically to disappear between shots does not get caught by luck. It gets caught by something that was already watching before it moved. The S-400 is Russia's long-range air defense system. NATO calls the family SA-21 Growler, and its job is simple to state and expensive to deliver. Own the sky in every direction, so nothing flies through that airspace without Moscow's permission. Pricing one is harder than it sounds, because the unit of account keeps moving. India's 2018 order bought 5 regiments for roughly $5.4 billion, a bit over $1 billion per regiment, and a regiment fields more than 1 firing battery. Read at the battery level. That same contract points closer to $500 million apiece, and Russia's own domestically built units almost certainly cost less again, though neither government publishes an exact figure. Take the lower number, because the argument does not need the higher one. $500 million of hardware is still worth well over $1 million of the cheap combat drones that are about to become this episode's other main character. Either way, a battery is not one machine. It is a cluster. Several truck-mounted launchers, a long-range detection radar, NATO calls Big Bird, 1 or more separate engagement radars, and a command post tying the whole thing together, spread across a patch of ground and camouflaged apart from each other on purpose. Losing 2 launchers and 4 missiles, which is what Belgorod cost Russia, is a real loss and a fraction of the whole. No single strike so far has taken out an entire battery in one pass. That dispersal is a design choice rather than an accident of where the trucks happen to park. Elements of a battery are typically spread hundreds of meters to a few kilometers apart, precisely so that one bad afternoon, one lucky strike on one launcher, does not take the radar and the command post down with it. Stories like this one only make sense when somebody walks through the mechanism instead of stopping at the headline number, and walking through the mechanism is what this channel does. Subscribing costs nothing and puts the next one in front of you. Against that $500 million cluster sits the other half of this story, a basic combat drone that costs somewhere between $300 and $500 to build. That price gap gets quoted constantly, and on its own it explains nothing, because a $500 drone still has to find its target before it can kill any part of it. Finding the target is the bottleneck, and it has been the bottleneck for a long time. What has kept the S-400 alive is mobility rather than armor or interceptors, neither of which it carries in the traditional sense. Doctrine written after the 1999 Kosovo air campaign taught Russian planners one lesson above all others. NATO flew 78 days of strikes against Serbia's mobile SA-6 batteries and still finished the campaign with most of that air defense network intact. Not because the missiles NATO used were bad, but because a battery that relocates every few hours is a battery that is almost never where the last satellite pass said it was. A SAM unit that never sits still long enough to be targeted is a SAM unit that survives. Shoot, then scoot, before the return fire arrives. Scale the 2 systems against each other, and the mismatch is almost absurd on paper. An S-400's engagement radar reaches out 250 kilometers or more, far enough to threaten an aircraft that hasn't even crossed into contested airspace yet. The drone that eventually finds the battery is watching from a spool that runs 10 to 15 kilometers on a good day. It is a system built to reach across a football field, defeated by something the size of a housefly sitting quietly on its own doorstep. Range was never the fiber-optic drone's advantage. Patience was. For 25 years that trade held, and the thing holding it up was sensing. Finding a mobile target reliably enough, and often enough, to close the reposition window instead of chasing yesterday's location was the part nobody had solved, and every tool available fell short of it in a different way. Satellites revisit on a schedule an adversary can predict. Manned reconnaissance aircraft cannot loiter over defended airspace for days at a time without getting shot down themselves. A radio-controlled drone gives itself away the instant it starts transmitting, usually well before it has watched long enough to matter. This episode is about the piece of hardware that finally closed that sensor gap. It did not outrun the S-400, and it did not outgun it. It learned to watch without ever being caught watching. The problem a fiber-optic drone solves begins with the radio link. A normal first-person view drone, an FPV, flies on that link. Video and control signals broadcast between the aircraft and its operator. The link can be jammed, and against a serious electronic warfare umbrella like the one ringing a Russian air defense position, it usually is. Reported loss rates for radio-controlled drones to jamming alone have run as high as 75% in some sectors of the front. A fiber-optic drone gets around that by not using radio at all. It physically unspools a hair-thin glass cable behind it as it flies, video and commands running down the wire the same way a landline phone call runs down a copper line instead of bouncing through the air like a mobile call. There is no signal to jam because there is nothing broadcast to intercept in the first place. The trade-off is weight and range. Current spools commonly run 10 to 15 kilometers before they run out of cable, though some demonstrated Russian spools have reportedly stretched past 40 kilometers on airframes built to carry the extra weight. Russia fielded the concept first, at meaningful scale, in August 2024 in Kursk, where a volunteer engineering group called Ushku-Inik built a fiber-optic drone named Knyaz Vandal Novgorodsky, specifically to counter Ukraine's cross-border incursion and its own jamming umbrella. Ukraine answered within months, showing its own fiber-optic FPVs to senior officers by December 2024, and by early 2025, more than a dozen domestic manufacturers were building them under the state's Brave One accelerator program. Neither side invented something exotic. They just noticed that a technology electricians have used underground for decades, running signal down glass instead of through the air, also happens to defeat the exact jamming systems built to stop everything else that flies. This did not stay a niche workshop project on either side. Ukraine's government has said the country's drone industry, across every category, can now build well over 1 million first-person view drones a year, and fiber-optic variants have gone from a specialist item to a standard line item in that production run in under 18 months. That scale matters here, because a persistent watch tactic only works as doctrine, repeatable and worth teaching to a reconnaissance brigade, once the aircraft that makes it possible is cheap and common enough to risk on a stakeout that might produce nothing. Early in the war, losing a drone to a dead battery or a snapped cable during an unproductive multi-hour watch would have been a real cost. At current production volumes, it is closer to a rounding error. The trade for that immunity is weight, and the number that matters is the spool. Glass fiber wound onto a bobbin under the drone's belly is not heavy the way a warhead is heavy, but it is dead mass on an airframe designed around grams, and unlike a battery pack, it cannot be swapped for something lighter partway through a mission. That is why the 40-plus kilometer spools reported on some Russian airframes stay the exception rather than the standard loadout. Past a certain length, more cable stops buying reach and starts buying nothing but a shorter flight. Fiber also fails in ways radio never does. A cable can snag on a tree line, abrade against a wall, or part under its own drag on a hard turn, and when it parts, the aircraft does not come home on a backup link because there is no backup link to come home on. It stops being a drone and becomes wreckage, still spooled to an operator who can no longer see through it. Fragility, as much as weight, is why the 10 to 15 kilometer class settled in as the working standard rather than a stepping stone towards something longer. That trade-off is worth making because of the way electronic warfare normally finds a drone. A jamming and detection unit listens for the radio conversation between the aircraft and its pilot, rather than hunting the aircraft itself, the same way a directional antenna can find a walkie-talkie by triangulating the signal instead of spotting the person holding it. Cut the radio conversation out entirely, and there is nothing left to triangulate. A fiber-optic drone in flight is, to every piece of Russian electronic warfare gear ringing that S-400 position, simply not there. It is a note passed by hand down a hallway instead of a message shouted across a crowded room. For a battery trying to hide, the dangerous property is this: a fiber-optic drone does not have to keep flying to keep watching. Because it gives off no radio signature, it can land near a road or a suspected staging area, cut its motor, and sit there watching through its own camera down the same cable, for as long as its battery holds and its spool stays intact, without ever tripping the electronic warfare detection gear that would normally flag a hovering radio drone in minutes. The motor stops, the camera keeps running, the cable keeps feeding, and nothing on the enemy's detection gear so much as flickers. That land and wait loitering is the mechanism behind a persistent watch story like this one. No public record ties a specific 9-day figure to the Belgorod battery. The reconnaissance unit that published the strike described an extended observation period without naming an exact count, and that gap is worth being honest about rather than papering over. What is documented, and what makes the premise plausible even without a pinned-down number, is the doctrine on the other side of the equation. A mobile SAM crew's entire survival plan depends on a simple assumption: reposition often enough, and briefly enough, that nobody gets a fix on you before you're gone again. Militaries generally describe that reposition and resume cycle in minutes, not hours, precisely because minutes is supposed to be too fast a window for an enemy sensor to exploit. A radio drone that has to keep transmitting to keep watching burns through that window constantly and flags itself the entire time it spends there. A fiber-optic drone that can sit silent and dark removes the one thing that used to make the minutes not hours plan work. It no longer has to catch the battery moving. It can already be there, unnoticed, when the battery decides to move on its own. The clock the S-400 crew is racing has nothing to do with the missile's flight time. It is how long the watcher can keep watching, and that number just changed from minutes to something closer to indefinite. Belgorod is not an isolated data point. Less than a year later, on August 8th into the 9th, 2026, Ukraine's 413th Separate Unmanned Systems Regiment, callsign Raid, struck an S-400 position on Russia's Black Sea coast near Gelendzhik. Robert Brovdy, callsign Magyar, who commands Ukraine's entire Unmanned Systems Forces branch, announced the strike publicly, though the Raid Regiment itself answers to its own commander, not to Brovdy directly. That position had fired 6 missiles the previous day, between roughly 9:25 in the morning and 12:50 in the early afternoon, and the strike that followed set the site burning for close to 3 hours. Firing a missile means lighting up a radar and giving away a location, which makes the position vulnerable in a completely different way than relocation does. But the underlying story is the same one told from a different angle. An S-400 crew did something it had to do: fire, move, reload, resupply, and paid for being watched while it did it. Doctrine can tell a crew to minimize how long any single action takes. It cannot tell them to stop acting altogether, and every action is a window. Go back further and the pattern holds without needing any one strike to carry it alone. In June 2025, Ukraine's military intelligence agency, known as GUR, said its primary unit, the Ghosts, had disabled 5 components of a single S-400 battery in occupied Crimea in one operation: 2 engagement radars, 2 Big Bird long-range detection radars, and a launcher. That is a GUR claim, reported by outlets including the War Zone, which hedged its own headline with the word claims rather than treating it as confirmed. It has not been independently verified the way Oryx verifies a loss with photographic or video proof. Label it for what it is: a Ukrainian government claim, not an established fact. Earlier still, in the spring of 2024, American-supplied ATACMS missiles struck S-400 components at Cape Tarkankut, also in occupied Crimea. Weeks later, between May 22nd and 24th, a separate ATACMS strike used cluster submunitions against S-300 and S-400 launchers near Mospine, in Russian-occupied Donetsk Oblast. Dozens of individual bomblets spread across a dispersed launcher line in a single pass, instead of one warhead against one vehicle. Then, in November of that same year, a Ukrainian telegram channel reported a third ATACMS strike at Bolshoye Zerovo in Russia's own Kursk Oblast, destroying an engagement radar and launch vehicles there too, though this one has not been independently verified the way the other two were. Satellite imagery and geolocation analysis corroborated Tarkhankut and Mospine independently, rather than on a single side's word alone. Oryx's visually confirmed count of S-400 losses across all of these incidents and others runs into the dozens, though the exact tally shifts as analysts re-verify footage. That churn is a small proof in itself that the record is being checked rather than taken on faith. None of these strikes, on their own, destroyed a $500 million battery, and the dollar figure should not be doing work it has not earned. A battery is built in pieces specifically so that no single strike bankrupts the whole thing. What has changed is the exchange rate on the pieces. A $300 to $500 aircraft, or a strike drone one step up from that price class, is now routinely taking out multi-million-dollar launchers and radars that used to count as survivable because they so rarely sat still long enough for anyone to hit. 6 documented or credibly claimed incidents across 2.5 years, Tarkhankut, Mospine, Bolshoye Zerovo, the Crimea Operation GUR describes, Belgorod, and Gelendzhik, spread across occupied Crimea, occupied Donetsk Oblast, and 3 separate regions inside Russia's own internationally recognized borders, is not a lucky streak. It keeps happening. It is a sensor problem nobody has solved, and it turns up again and again against the same system, in the same general shape, regardless of which specific weapon finishes the job. One caveat belongs on the record here. Not every one of these losses can be tied to a fiber-optic drone specifically. Belgorod's own footage doesn't specify whether the final approach ran on radio or on wire, and several of the incidents above used missiles, not drones at all. What the pattern proves is narrower and still significant. Russian long-range air defense is being found and hit at a rate and a price point it was never designed to survive, across multiple regions, using multiple methods, with fiber-optic loitering drones as one documented and rapidly scaling piece of how that finding happens. A viewer looking for a single smoking gun video of a fiber-optic drone parked outside an S-400 site for 9 straight days will not find one publicly. What is published, repeatedly, at Oryx and in the Reconnaissance Brigade's own footage, is case after case of the same battery type getting caught exactly when doctrine says it should be safest, mid-move and mid-reload, against a drone class built specifically to watch without being caught watching. That is the documented capability behind this episode's title. The exact day count on any one battery is this channel's own framing of that capability, not a number lifted from a source, and it is worth saying that out loud before anyone repeats it as a figure. The old math around a system like the S-400 assumed that mobility was armor. Stay hidden between shots, and the missile that could have killed you never gets the chance to be aimed. What Belgorod, Gelendzhik, and every geolocated strike between them demonstrate is that mobility only works as armor against an enemy who has to catch you moving. A sensor that can sit silent for as long as its battery lasts does not have to catch anything. It just has to already be there. That is not only Russia's problem. The S-400 is Russia's most successful arms export of the last decade, sold to India, China, and Turkey, among others, partly on the promise that a battery this mobile was a battery that would survive. India's own 5 Regiment purchase, the same one that priced this episode's hardware earlier, was built on that assumption. Nothing in this record proves those export customers are watched the way this Russian regiment was. But the mechanism that found this battery does not require Russian soil or a Russian supply chain to work. It requires cheap airframes, glass cable, and patience, and none of those 3 respect a border. 3 things follow from all of this, and none of them ends the story. First, Russian units will almost certainly compress their reposition cycles further, moving more often and more briefly than doctrine used to require, and start dedicating resources specifically to hunting the drones doing the watching, rather than just the ones doing the striking. That is the same arms race pattern running through every other part of this war. Jammer against fiber, decoy against sensor, each fix buying months rather than years before the other side adjusts. Second, nobody is going to close the mismatch between a $500 aircraft and $500 million of hardware by making air defense cheaper. The likelier path runs the other way, by making persistent reconnaissance more expensive to counter, which pushes the cost logic of this kind of warfare somewhere air defense procurement was never designed around. And third, every S-400 crew relocating anywhere near a front line or an export customer's own border now has to operate on an assumption its doctrine never used to require, that something might already be watching, quietly, before the order to move ever comes down. Nothing has to explode for that assumption to change behavior. It changes it on the quiet days too, and it is very hard to design your way back out of, once an enemy has shown they can do it more than once. What happens when the watchers themselves become the target worth hunting is the next question this war keeps asking, and the answer is still being worked out in the fields between the launchers.